There you go. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for attending our program tonight with Gene Becker, who wrote the book about George H.W. Bush, The Man I Knew, the book about, there it is, The Man I Knew, the book about George H.W. Bush's post-presidency, but it does include part of his presidency. Let me introduce Ms. Becker, or Jean, as she told me I could call her tonight.
I hope so.
That's right. That's how we'll be conducting the talk, and I'm Brack Stovall. I'm a librarian at the Alexandria Library. One of the things that struck me about The Man I Knew was in the very beginning, Jean says she was a Democrat, and she was given this opportunity to work for the Bushes, and first with Barbara Bush, and she was reluctant being a Democrat in a time really before most of us see today, because when people could cross party lines and have a fulfilling and purposeful life. She went to her father and said, "What should I do?" And he said, Jean.
He said, he said, let me get this straight. I was offered this job. I was a reporter at USA Today. I was very happy. I was asked to join Barbara Bush's White House staff as a deputy press secretary. And I thought about it for a couple of weeks. And I went home to Missouri. My dad was a farmer in Missouri. He never graduated from high school, but he was one of the smartest men I knew. I told him, my mom had already died, but I told him that this unexpected opportunity had come up, and I was offered a job at the White House to work for the First Lady. And I said, I don't know what to do. And my dad looked at me, Brack, and he said, let me get this straight. The incoming First Lady of the United States of America has offered you a job in the White House, and you're thinking about it? He says, what? And you know what? I walked to the phone. I called her chief of staff, Susan Porter Rhodes, and I said, yes. And I never looked back. And yes, I grew up a Democrat. They never asked me. No one ever asked me at the White House what my politics were. And they didn't ask, and I didn't tell.
And I really like that story. I'm going to read your biography, which I have here. It's Gene Becker has been chief of staff to former President George H.W. Bush since 1994, supervising his office in both Houston and Kennebunkport, Maine, and overseeing the opening of the George Bush Presidential Library Center in 1997. She took a leave of absence in 1999 to edit and research All the Best, George Bush, My Life in Letters, and Other Writings. Previously, Jean served as deputy press secretary to First Lady Barbara Bush from 1989 to 1992 and helped Mrs. Bush with the editing and research for her books, Barbara Bush, A Memoir, and Reflections. A former journalist, she is also a member of the J. William Fulbright Foreign Scholarship Board and the Sea Change Cancer Board, and an ad hoc member of the advisory boards of the George Bush Presidential Library and the George Bush School of Government and Public Service. Now tonight, we're going to have a very informal conversation. In fact, just to give you an idea, when I read The Man I Knew, I kept my notepad next to me and I asked questions as if knowing that I would have the opportunity to ask these questions to Jean. So I'm going to go through, these are pretty much along the lines of as I read them in the book. And I would like to invite the participants, if you have questions, to put a question in the Q&A box. You can also put it into the chat. I will find it and I will then ask those questions when I get an opportunity to, as we have our informal conversation this evening.
Brack, can I add a PS to your opening comment about my growing up a Democrat?
Certainly.
And this isn't in the book, so you wouldn't know to ask this. So by the time I went to work for the Bushes, my dad was a Republican. He would tell you that Jimmy Carter turned all farmers into Republicans because of the Soviet grain embargo when he was president. But anyway, I was sort of apolitical for a while, but I was a George Bush Republican. And about 2016, right around in there, I told President Bush, I said, sir, I feel like you deserve to know that your chief of staff no longer considers herself a Republican. I now consider myself an independent, but I'm not a Republican. And I just thought maybe you would want to know that. And he looked at me, Brack, and he patted me on my knee and he said, you were never that good of one to begin with. It's one of the favorite things he ever said to me.
Well, I think, it's very interesting. We just got a first question in the Q&A box. And this is actually, I like this because this really, it brings us up to date in a question of how would George H.W. Bush, participate in today's activities. The question is, do you think President Bush would have enjoyed playing Wordle?
This Barbara Bush would be all over Wordle. President Bush, maybe would play Wordle. I think he would, of the trends today, President Bush would be all about pickleball. And his children, his son Marvin actually has a pickleball tournament and now at Walker's Point in Maine every summer. But Mrs. Bush would be the Wordler of the family. And actually, I'm in two Wordle groups, one of which is some of my family and great friends, but the Bush family kids and grandkids and some of their friends, they have a Wordle group, and Neil Bush is the commissioner. And so the Bushes are all avid Wordlers. That's a funny question. And just for the record, whoever asked that, I got today's question and one guess. Don't ask, but I did.
Very good. Very good. My wife plays Wordle too every morning. It's the first thing she does when she gets up before the coffee comes upstairs. In 2004, trip to Athens Olympics, you describe early on in your book, you get the sense that President Bush fell easily into his role as the United States world representative. Can you share how your thoughts on this, how he carried his responsibility with this?
His son, the President of the United States, George W. Bush, asked his dad and mom and dad, to head up the U.S. delegation to the Olympics in Greece that year. And, President Bush was in heaven. He knew so many people yet on the world stage. He had so many friends yet who were still head of state, or a lot of the current head of states. He had met them earlier when they were vice presidents or ambassadors. And so for him to be able to go to Athens, and he hosted a big party. We were actually staying on a boat that belonged to a good friend of his, and he hosted a big party on the boat. And he just was in his element, and security was so tight at that Olympics, Brack. That was the first Olympics after 9/11. And there were a lot of concerns about security in Athens, and for good reasons. And I won't share them because I think what I know is classified. So I'm not going to say, and plus I've forgotten a lot of it. But there was some concern. The Secret Service really didn't want President Bush and Mrs. Bush to go. They didn't think it was safe enough, and President Bush would not hear it. He loved meeting with from leaders all over the world, and just had a great time.
That makes me think of a question and we talked about this earlier before about the elitism of political leaders, and really George H.W. Bush, he was an oil man. He had a lot of and a lot of the political elite that he met with were really at his level. Could you talk about that for a moment? Where he felt like he fit in with all of these other leaders who were also in very way elitist, but he has a certain edge that doesn't always, I don't think, carries over what we consider, the elitism of other countries.
There was sort of this myth about President Bush a lot of the time while he was in public life, that he was a New England elitist or a Northeastern elitist. He had gone to Andover, he had gone to Yale, but he was probably one of the Lise, oh goodness, yeah, there's all his friends. I'll talk about that in a minute. Anyway, President Bush had friends. We'll have to go back to that in a minute. I can tell who everybody is. He has friends. He had friends from all walks of life. And it's one of the things I loved about him the most. He could hang out with Queen Elizabeth and be very comfortable. I was in the room when he and Helmut Kohl told jokes to each other, but he also was very good friends with the Syrian immigrant who owned the pizza place 2 blocks from his office, and he had picked him to be one of his pallbearers. And he just was amazing how he never figured out that he was the most important person in the room. And that's one of the things I loved about him, is we would walk into a room and he would say, oh my gosh, Jean, look over there. It's Roger Clemens. And I'd be like, okay, but yeah, you're the president or former president. But if you go back to that picture, Brack, that you just showed, this is a great example of how much respect he had on the world stage. His 80th birthday, he turned 80 in 2004. And we were going to do this huge fundraiser here in Houston at Minute Maid Park where the Astros play baseball. We were raising money for MD Anderson Cancer Hospital, for the George Bush School of Government and Public Service, and for Points of Light. And we invited everybody he knew. This included everybody from the pizza man to Mikhail Gorbachev. Everybody got the same invitation. And what shocked us, what we didn't see coming, these are all the people who showed up. You see Mikhail Gorbachev is right in front. That Shimon Peres of Israel next to him. Carlos Salinas is next. I'm pretty sure that's Mila Mulroney. Her husband is Brian Mulroney of Canada. Next to Mila Mulroney is John Major from Great Britain, Barbara Bush. The next man is Pavel, that was Gorbachev's interpreter, Brian Mulroney. And then that woman is Carlos Salinas's wife. But we didn't see this coming, that all these, at this point, they were all former heads of state. But President Bush, the Minute Maid Park was full of everybody from his favorite waiters, from his favorite restaurants, to this group of people. By the way, if we run out of things to talk about, that is the night that Mikhail Gorbachev told me to shut up. And I would be happy to tell that story if we have time.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to that. One of the things it's really interesting, and I think that picture depicts it. Was that at Kennebunkport where that was?
It was in Houston. No,
was
Houston. And that particular, when all of those heads of state came, President Bush said, oh my gosh, I better have a lunch for them. So that's a lunch that he had for his world leader friends at the Houston Country Club. But they were in the baseball stadium with everybody else that night.
Well, he did spend a lot of time in Kennebunkport, and I'm curious as what kind of impact that had on the community. Especially you relate a story when he had Putin there, and I had to put Putin in here because we get his actual height here, I think.
I love that. He's short. He's short. Here is my great sadness, and I owe an apology to the entire world, including especially Ukraine. I should have just pushed him off the wall at Walker's Point that day. I think I had the opportunity to push him into the Atlantic Ocean. I didn't do it. This is actually the President of the United States, George W., invited Putin to come to Maine, to the family compound, Walker's Point, in 2007, so they could have a bilateral meeting. And President Bush, his dad, was just thrilled to host them. And I guarantee you, if President Bush knew then what he knows, if he knew then what's going on now, I think there might have been a little accident at sea. I'm not sure. I can't promise that. I hope that doesn't make news. I hope I don't see in the Washington Post tomorrow, Jean Becker predicts that 41 would have killed Putin.
Well, how did that affect the community of Kennebunkport? You know, he had lots of people who came and
oh my gosh, they were first of all, they adored George and Barbara Bush, and they knew that they were always excited about all the activity at Walker's Point. And I remember one time the president of Afghanistan, President Bush would always, there was a flag store in a nearby town, and President Bush, if there was a head of state coming, he would go buy the flag of that country and fly the flag at Walker's Point to welcome whoever was coming. Well, the first president of Afghanistan after 9/11, oh my gosh, I'm drawing a blank on what his name was, which is embarrassing, but he was coming in a very secret meeting. His security was extraordinarily tight. There was going to be no press coverage, but he had asked to meet with President Bush. He was a big admirer, and he just wanted to seek advice from him. And of course, President Bush said, of course, I will happily meet with you. And it was all very classified, Brack, and very secret for security reasons. And President Bush went to the flag store and bought the Afghan flag and flew it at Walker's Point. And I said, sir, no one's supposed to know the president of Afghanistan is here. You cannot fly that flag. And he says, Jean, no one knows the Afghan flag. This is not going to be a problem. So he flew the flag, but they were, the people in Kennebunkport were excited. They never ever knew who they were going to run into. Gorbachev came one time to visit, and President Bush took him to lunch at his favorite place. And I was sitting at another table, and you remember the old show Candid Camera? It were people, they would have these shocking situations. Well, but he took Mikhail Gorbachev to a place called Barnacle Billy's for lunch. The people would walk in and just say, what? How could that be? So it was a fun time for that area. They loved it. They really loved it.
Okay, so now one thing I want to really talk about is if you could talk about the relationship between Bill Clinton and President Bush.
Brack, when I was writing the book, I really wrote the book just because I had so many wonderful stories to tell about his post-presidency. But I realized as I was writing the book that there really was something more important at work than just my good stories. President Bush really, gosh, he really left us a blueprint on how to live a life well lived. He lived life with passion and principle, and he believed in giving back. And I never met anyone who had the ability to find the best in everybody he met. The 1992 election was difficult. President Bush once said that his dog Millie knew more about foreign affairs than Bill Clinton did. And Bill Clinton used to say, it's the economy, stupid. Here they are on January 20th, 1993. The Clintons are arriving at the White House for the first time to get ready to go to the inauguration. And there's President and Mrs. Bush greeting them. And it was, it was all very cordial and very civilized, as it should be. But then a few years later, they became partners, and then they became best friends. They became the disaster couple. They raised hundreds of millions of dollars of money for disaster relief after the tsunami in South Asia in 2004, Katrina, of course, in 2005, Hurricane Ike here in Texas, Hurricane Harvey in Houston. And they were truly, here they are in Indonesia, meeting with a group of kids whose school had been destroyed in the tsunami. They're going to school in the dirt. They left on that trip as colleagues with a common cause, a common purpose, and they came home best friends. And just quickly, I'll tell you why. We didn't know then yet that President Bush, he was definitely in the early stages of Parkinson's. We didn't know that. He didn't know that. But we knew the people around him, we knew he was unsteady on his feet. He was just a little slow, getting up and getting down. He had fallen a couple of times. So I had never met President Clinton, but I put a bug in his ear on our way to Indonesia. I told him, asked him to look out for President Bush. I said, I sort of explained what was going on. And I said, would you maybe sometimes help him on and off the plane, be very discreet? You and I never had this conversation. Well, President Clinton took it to heart. He took such good care of him and always made sure he did not leave him behind. The flip side of this is George Bush was never late to anything. President Clinton was never on time to anything. President Bush was determined to keep us on time. We had a lot of ground to cover, a lot of people to meet. And his staff, President Clinton's staff, wouldn't pull him out of a meeting. But so President Bush would say, Bill, quit talking and get in the car. And President Clinton would say, yes, sir. And so it really developed this father and son relationship. Mrs. Bush always said that in her husband, Bill Clinton found the father he never had. They truly loved each other. And in the process, they raised a lot of money. But Brack, what a great example for all of us that friendship is. You can agree to disagree. I sat in on some of their political discussions, and they didn't agree on hardly anything. But at the end of the day, they were good friends. The politics didn't matter. What mattered was making a difference in the world. And boy, did they do that.
I think that answers the next question I was going to ask, and it gives you a chance to demonstrate the power of bipartisan, reaching across people. I mean, really, if you think about it, we're all individually, like we have a divide between all of us, and we're always reaching over to the other to understand how the other sees the world.
Well, and it was important. It was 43. It was George W. Bush who was the matchmaker between them. He needed them to raise money in the private sector after that horrific tsunami, because all of our great nonprofits like the Red Cross and Doctors Without Borders and AmeriCares, Catholic Charities, they were all racing to Asia to help, but they needed huge amounts of money. It was one of the worst disasters in the history of the world. And President Bush 43 felt that if his dad would partner with President Clinton, he needed this to be not just a bipartisan, but a nonpartisan fundraising effort. Well, guess what? They raised hundreds of millions of dollars because it was so not political. And we need more partnerships like that now.
I agree. But I'm going to bring up something now that came from a question in the viewers here, something that maybe we can't find, common ground on. Could you tell the story about your disagreement with President Bush over who was the best hitter in baseball history?
Okay, that's somebody I know who asked that question. Okay, so President Bush and I would have our disagreements. I'm a huge St. Louis Cardinal fan, which greatly disappointed him. He felt like I should have become an Astros fan, but that's another whole story. Well, our great hitter and star for years was Albert Pujols, who, by the way, has come back to the Cardinals this year after about a 5-year absence that broke our heart. Anyway, this was years ago. I had just read an article that if Albert Pujols stayed healthy, his statistics were beginning to look like he could retire as the best hitter in baseball. So I'm at an Astros Cardinal baseball game with President Bush. Albert hits a home run, and a towering home run. And as he's trotting around the bases, I say to President Bush, sir, we could be watching the best hitter to ever play the game. Oh my God. He was furious. And he said, have you heard of Ted Williams? Gee, have you heard of Ted Williams? I says, well, yes, sir. Of course, I have heard of Ted Williams. And he says, Ted Williams is the greatest hitter to ever play the game. And I'm just embarrassed for you that you would even say that. And he never got over it. One time, Secretary James Baker said to me, he'd been playing golf with President Bush all day. And I saw him later in the day. This is a couple years later. And Secretary Baker said, Gene, did you really want to say to President Bush that Albert Pujols was a better hitter than Ted Williams? I said, oh my gosh, I told him that years ago. And he says, he's still really mad about it. He brought it up on the golf course this afternoon. So Brack, when I was packing my office after President Bush died, can I walk over here for a minute? I found in my desk, I forgot that I had this. President Bush had been invited to an HBO special on Ted Williams. And the name of the special was There Goes the Greatest Hitter That Ever Lived. They invited President Bush to the premiere of this. And I found it on my desk with this. This is his handwriting on a yellow sticky. See, Gene, exclamation, exclamation point, watch and learn. I was so thrilled when I found this. Because it's just a wonderful, sweet memory of the biggest fight we ever had, which that tells you a lot about our relationship, that the biggest fight we ever had was about baseball.
Well, I'm sure.
Did that question come from Gene Gibbons?
Well, I probably should keep it anonymous, but I would say, obviously he would have the inside scoop. Well, President Bush was, it was during his time as president when the Berlin Wall came down and the reunification of Germany took place. Could you talk about how you felt like that, how critical his impact was and what you knew of him personally, which, that was really a very, momentous period in history. Mm-hmm. And he was, I've read so many related to this, that he was the right person at the right time in history for that. Could you talk about that?
I will. I would love to, but I would like to preface it by reminding everybody that when he was president of the United States, I was in the East Wing and the First Lady's press office. So I tried not to talk too much about his presidency because I wasn't part of the team then. However, as his chief of staff for 25 years, we did celebrate the reunification of Germany and the fall of the Berlin Wall. Every anniversary, we would the 10-year, 20-year, and I've heard him talk a lot about it. And what he was particularly proud of, Brack, was the reunification of Germany, mainly because no one thought it would happen. Both Margaret Thatcher, who was then the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and Francois Mitterrand, who was the Prime Minister of France, very opposed to the reunification of Germany. Francois Mitterrand famously told President Bush, Mr. President, I like Germany so much, I think there should be two of them. And definitely Mikhail Gorbachev was opposed, very opposed to the reunification of Germany. A unified Germany he felt would make the Soviet Union very nervous. President Bush was absolutely determined to correct this wrong after World War II, when the Allies divided Germany and gave half became part of the Soviet Union sphere of influence, of course, and then half was West Germany. And President Bush felt after the end of the Cold War, after the Soviet Union, actually this all happened after the Soviet Union went away, he needed to fix this problem. And it is probably the best example of just what an extraordinary diplomat he was, that he began with everybody against him. I think Brian Mulroney of Canada was on his side, and that was it. And eventually there's now one Germany. It was unified under his leadership. And he was very proud of that.
Well, I think you can see the seeds of this in your telling of the story when he, after the presidency, when he went to Chichima and visited the island once again after his plane had crashed. Could you tell that story? And yeah, it's a wonderful story. It brought tears to my eyes when I was reading this.
It was, so this is a picture. President Bush was a naval aviator, and he was shot down on September 2nd, 1944, over the island of Chichima in the South Pacific. Believe it or not, there is video and photos of him being rescued. There are the sailors of the USS Finback submarine pulling him out of the sea. He was in the water for about 3 hours before he got rescued. His 2 crew members had died. And I think it was January of 2002, President Bush sat down in my office and he said, I need to go back to Chichijima. He said, I need to go back. And he said, so let's talk about that. It was the hardest thing I did as his chief of staff. Logistically, it is not easy to get from Houston, Texas to Chichijima. It's a 33-hour boat ride from Tokyo. It's a volcanic island, so there's no airport. So we couldn't fly in. The US Navy, I called the Navy and they very much wanted to take him. We have a huge fleet always in the Pacific. He was a naval aviator. He's such a hero in the Navy. The problem was the name of the president at that time was George W. Bush. And there was some concern on President Bush's part that it just would not look appropriate for the Navy to take him to fulfill this wish he had on his bucket list. He didn't feel comfortable with that. So ironically, Breck, it is the Japanese Navy who took him. Our ambassador in Tokyo was the amazing Howard Baker, the longtime senator from Tennessee. And he had just arrived Tokyo to be the ambassador from the United States. And President Bush picked up the phone and called his good friend and said, Howard, I want to go to Chichijima. And Howard Baker called the prime minister of of Japan, and they were thrilled to host him. So President Bush flew in. We flew in by helicopter on a Japanese Navy helicopter. They took the exact same bombing route that he had taken that day. His job was to take out a radio tower. Chichijima had these radio towers that were important to the Japanese Navy communication system. And they took the exact same bombing route and they knew what it was, which surprised President Bush. He said they got it absolutely right. But the people on Chichijima is a population of about 2,000. And I think I said in the book that only 1,198 of them showed up. They were so excited he was there, screaming and yelling, and they treated him like a welcoming hero. And one of our Japanese hosts leaned over and said to me, the emperor came a couple years ago and he didn't get near this good of reception. The reception for President Bush is much bigger. The amazing thing, Brack, is while we were there, we met a man who was born in Honolulu. He was Japanese American. And when Pearl Harbor, after December 7th, 1941, his parents did not feel safe in Hawaii for good reason. As we all know, the Japanese were rounded up and put into camps until the end of the war. They fled back to Tokyo, and their son was immediately conscripted into the Japanese Navy. He was stationed on Chichijima. He spoke perfect English, and his job was to help the commander of the island interrogate the pilots that they shot down. And after they interrogated them, that they killed them, and the commander ate their livers and their hearts. He was executed for war crimes after the war. President Bush loved to tease Mrs. Bush that he was almost an hors d'oeuvre. But Warren told President Bush that he saw him shot down, that he was high up on a cliff with a work detail, and they saw his plane go into the water. And he and his fellow Japanese sailors stopped and was sort of watching the drama in front of them. President Bush's squadron stuck with him as long as they could, chafing the Japanese boats with firing at them to keep them from picking them up. Eventually, they had to leave them there. They're about ready to run out of gas. They dipped their wings to say goodbye. They assumed forever, because the Japanese boats immediately set out from the island to pick up the pilot in the water. And about that time, the USS Finback submarine rose out of the depth of the Pacific Ocean and plucked him out. And Warren told President Bush that when he saw that happen, he said to his fellow Japanese sailors, I said, America is going to win the war because they respect life more than we do. We would have never, ever exposed one of our submarines to save one man. It was a very moving trip. And I do think it gave President Bush some closure. And I think he needed closure. It's all about his two crew members who died, who he told me he thought about every day.
I think when I read that part, I was, my initial reaction was, well, his father was probably this influential senator, but then I found out later on that Prescott Bush, who was, a member of Congress and an influential, politician and congressman, and he was a banker. And really, in a way, George H.W. Bush, when he crashed, he was just one of the everyman.
Right.
And that's what impressed me.
Exactly right.
There was nothing special. And I wondered about that, how that affected, because that was really a near-death experience. And I wondered how that affected his viewing. In fact, you talk about his 9 lives. He talks about his 9 lives.
He had about 17 lives. He loved to talk about that. But Brack, you're so right. President Bush, we talked about it a lot, and he wrote about it as well. It did change his life for a couple of reasons. The main one being, when a submarine like the Finback picked up a pilot out of the water, I think there were 5 rescued pilots on board the Finback the same time as President Bush. They had to hot bunk. And that means that they had to share a bunk with one of the Finback sailors. So the pilots would stand watch at night. The submarine would come up out of the ocean at night and run on the surface. And it was the job of the rescue pilots to stand watch. And then they would sleep during the day when there was an available bunk. And President Bush said spending a whole month of nights standing out on that submarine and looking at the night sky, he kept saying and thinking and praying, why me? Why me, God? Why did you spare my life? And he said that he realized then he had to make something of himself, that his 2 crew members had died. His life had been spared for reasons he didn't understand. And he made a determination on board that submarine, standing watch at night, looking at the moon and the stars, that he had to make something of himself to thank his God and his country for this opportunity. I think it influenced him for the rest of his life. It's one of the reasons why, instead of going to Wall Street, which he was expected to do, he bought a red Studebaker and drove to Texas and became an oil rig salesman. He he sold parts. He sold his first job in the oil industry is he sold parts for the oil rigs in West Texas. That's how he started out.
Wow, I didn't know that. That's amazing. That's amazing. On a lighter note, in your chapter, This Isn't the White House Anymore, I wanted to know what happened to all the coffee cups.
Okay, that memo is one of my editor's favorite things in the book. My advice to all of you who are listening tonight, somebody just tried to give me a coffee cup last week. Everybody has enough coffee cups, enough baseball caps, enough tote bags, and enough t-shirts. We had hundreds of coffee cups because everywhere President Bush went, they wanted to give him a coffee cup with their logo on it. I'm drinking out of a cup tonight that has the logo of the USS George H.W. Bush aircraft carrier on it. Everybody has a cup. So President Bush wrote this very funny memo. We had this huge group of volunteers who would come in every day and help open the mail and answer the mail. And he said, he wrote this memo and he said, we have too many coffee cups, that he was having nightmares about coffee cups at night. And the memo is very funny. I mean, some of it is not exactly appropriate. He was one supermodel at that time had a famous photo wearing a bikini. He named the model and he said, in my dream, she is wearing coffee cups instead of a bikini. You have to end this nightmare for me. And he said, please take the coffee cups away. So when we closed the office of George Bush, after he died, I told the volunteers it was their duty to take home all these coffee cups, and they divided them up and they took them home.
So none of them are making it their way to eBay, are they, at this time?
Well, maybe they might be. Some of the office of George Bush coffee cups may be on eBay. They could be worth a fortune at this point.
So this is something we had talked about before in your chapter on John Meacham writing the G.H.W. Bush biography and having access to the diaries of both 41, as he was endearingly called, and Barbara Bush. Makes me wonder, did George H.W. Bush seeing himself from a distance, do you think he wanted to have history view him critically? He doesn't seem to have the ego that a lot of people who get to that place are, and his actions appear that he did not really care how history looked at him, whether critically or not.
He didn't. I love that you made that observation. He did not write his autobiography, which is almost unheard of. A lot of people, including me, begged him to write his autobiography. And he always said the same thing: let history be the judge. And what we ended up doing instead of his autobiography is we did a book of letters called All the Best. And the idea was to do a coffee table book. There was some amazing letters he had written over the years, including the letter he wrote his mother the day after he was shot down. But as I did the research for that book, and I just found letter after letter after letter. So we were able to tell his life story through those letters. But he opened up all the files that come out of National Archives and go to the presidential libraries. There's a process for opening them up for reporters and researchers. And President Bush said, open them all up. I mean, they have to be read looking for classified information. President Bush really pushed the process along. He wanted all the papers to be open. But the most amazing thing he did was to turn his diaries over to historian John Meacham. And we gave John Meacham has full rights to those diaries. And he will be publishing the book. John used a lot of the diary info in the biography he did of President Bush called Destiny and Power. But right around President Bush's 100th birthday, which is in 2 years, John is going to release a book based strictly on the diaries. And President Bush, are there some things in there that President Bush probably would prefer not be known? Maybe. I've read them. There's a few things that people might say, really? But he felt just let history be the judge. He was not afraid at all of any of that. He opened up his books to everybody.
Wow. Well, this is one of my favorite parts of the book. One of the favorite person who just came out of nowhere, really, Don Rhodes. Would you talk about Don Rhodes?
Oh, you'll forever be one of my favorite people for asking about Don Rhodes. No one ever asked about Don. So Don was a Texas A&M Aggie. He was very smart, but he was almost completely deaf. And we're not really sure why. He had a very rough childhood. And we found out years later, the Bushes didn't know this, that Don's mother had actually been a prostitute. And so he had a rough childhood. But in 1964, when President Bush, George Bush, was running for the US Senate here in Houston, Texas, young Don Rhodes walked into the campaign office one day to be a volunteer. and he started licking envelopes and putting out yard signs. And President Bush saw a young man who was adrift. You know, he obviously was struggling with where he was supposed to be in life. He worked for George and Barbara Bush the rest of his life until Don died. They basically took him in, and Don was very smart. People really didn't understand Don. I'm not sure why, Brack, but Don didn't take a lot of showers. He wasn't into showering. He wore the same navy blue jacket or royal blue jacket for 30 years. He was a curmudgeon, definitely a curmudgeon, but he had a heart of gold, very principled, very smart. He kept the books. He was President Bush's sort of official, he's the one who did his taxes. He was sort of his personal go-to man. And they were very close. And people, when I first saw Don Rhodes, I had no idea who he was. He had an office in the White House in the East Wing downstairs and did all the personal business of the president. He was on not the government payroll, but personal payroll. But he sat sort of in this like closet-like office. I remember I came upstairs to the East Wing and I said, I think a homeless person has gotten into the White House. I just ran into a man who I think may be homeless. And somebody in the East Wing who had worked for the Bushes for years said, oh, that's Don Rhodes. But he was one of President Bush's closest friends. And I adored him. He was a wonderful, wonderful person. President Bush was devastated when he died. But I will tell you, Brack, that Don Rhodes was meant to die before George Bush, but because I don't think Don could have survived without him.
Wow.
Yeah.
Unlikely connections in George H.W. Bush had with some of the more liberal entertainment people. Could you tell about those events where he was brought together with?
He, President Bush would, a lot of this was in the interest of raising money for good causes. And probably my favorite story, this is right after Hurricane Katrina had devastated New Orleans. What a lot of people in the country don't know, they know it here in Texas and they know it in Louisiana. About a week after Katrina, there was a second hurricane called Hurricane Rita, came ashore, destroyed what was left of the Louisiana coastline west of New Orleans, also hit Texas really hard. And the towns that were hit by Rita were really having a hard time getting any help. They couldn't get any help. Everybody was in New Orleans, the media, everybody, all the attention is in New Orleans. So this man called our office one day and wanted to know if President Bush could help this little town called Cameron, Louisiana, that had almost been leveled by Rita. And their hospital, among other things, their hospital had been destroyed. And his name was Richard Slushlag. And Richard said, unless we need to bring healthcare back to town first, because the closest hospital was 40 miles away. He said, would President Bush help us raise money to rebuild just the emergency room? If we can just rebuild the emergency room, we can build the rest of the hospital, later, but we need a quick fix. And President Bush, of course, said yes. So we raised $2 million and we're going to New Orleans the week before Christmas to give them a check for $2 million and to break ground for the new emergency room. And the governor was coming and the marching band, and it was a lovely little day, and they're going to break ground, and then we come back to Houston. And President Bush is looking at the schedule, Brack, and he said to me, Jean, the schedule is boring, really boring. And I said, with attitude, maybe a little attitude, I said, I personally think a former president coming to town the week before Christmas with $2 million is not boring. That's very exciting. And he said, Jean, I have an idea. I have a whole chapter called I Have an Idea. It used to scare the hell out of me when he said that, because I would be like, oh my God, what do you want to do now? He says, Bar and I have fallen in love with this TV show. It's on every night. It's called ER. And there's this young actor in it, not sure if you've heard of him. His name is George Clooney. I think he's the star. And I think it would be fun if George Clooney came to Cameron with us. He says, Jane, do you get it? ER, ER. The man from ER can help us open the new ER. Well, Brack, here was the problem with that idea. ER was no longer on TV. They were watching it in reruns on TBS. George Clooney was a huge movie star. He had started making all those ocean movies. And I said to him, I said, sir, I told him this. I said, ER is not even on TV anymore. And he looked at me and he said, every night, Bar and I watch it every night. Well, he was one of the smartest people I knew, but as a former president of the United States, he did not get reruns. All he knew is that this show was on TV. And I said, you know what, sir, with all due respect, we don't know George Clooney. His politics are way to the left of yours. I just can't imagine that George Clooney is going to be excited to come to Cameron, Louisiana with you the week before Christmas. I said, this isn't going to happen. I don't know how to call him. I don't know anybody who knows him. This is not going to happen. And I think you have a picture to show everybody. You know, you just could never count George Bush out. And this is why working with him was so much fun. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, that would be George Clooney. And we are in Cameron, Louisiana, the week before Christmas. President Bush Googled him and found out that the producer of all those ocean movies was a friend of his, a guy named Jerry Weintraub. And President Bush called Jerry Weintraub, who called George Clooney. And George Clooney, who I'm just his biggest fan, not because he's so darn pretty and cute. He has a big heart. He came. And I asked him why he came. And look at them. Are those about the two cutest Georges you've ever seen ever before? I asked George Clooney coming home, I said, why did you come? Why did you do this? And he said, you know, everybody's in New Orleans and George Clooney didn't even know there had been a Hurricane Rita until we reached out to him through Jerry Weintraub. And he said, I was so impressed that President Bush, with no press, with no, credit, was trying to help this little town in Louisiana who needed help. He said, I want to come be a part of this. They stayed friends until they died, until President Bush died. President Bush was always very upset when George Clooney didn't win an Oscar. He would call him every Monday, Brack, after the Academy Award ceremony. And he would say, George, Barr and I are very upset. We felt your movie should have won Best Movie last night. It was a dear friendship.
Okay, I've got another question I'd like to ask, and I do have a question from the audience I will ask after this, but I want to know, I'd like to have you tell the story about George and Barbara Bush's love story.
Oh.
They are just, I mean, some of there's a part in there where you talk about when he was coming in the other room and she was pinching her cheeks.
Oh gosh.
And
you know what, we knew, actually back in the White House days, I remember one time I'd been traveling with the First Lady and she gets back to the White House. We get back to the White House very late at night one night. And there's a man standing at the east door, on the east side of the White House where the motorcade always came. And actually it's the south portico of the White House. And there's a guy with a cowboy hat and blue jeans, and we're all like, who the heck is that? Well, it was the President of the United States outside waiting to greet his wife. And they were just sweet. I remember one time we were in Kennebunkport. I was visiting with Mrs. Bush in her bedroom. I was helping her write her memoirs. And we were talking about her book. And President Bush walked in the door and yelled out her name. And the first thing she did was stand up and go to a mirror and pinch her cheeks and to start to fix her hair. They'd been married at that point for 50 years. But she still, wanted to look her best for her man. one of my favorite stories, and I used to not be able to tell this without crying, but I've gotten better. This was toward the end of their lives. They both were complaining to me a lot how much the other one snored. And President Bush would say, oh my gosh, Barr sounds like a Mack truck at night. I haven't slept in days and nights. And then I would see Mrs. Bush and he says, oh, Jean, you just wouldn't believe George just, snores. It's just horrible. So finally, after a couple of weeks of this, I said to President Bush, I said, sir, I think maybe it's time. It's none of my business, but maybe you all should think about sleeping in separate bedrooms. I said, sleep is so important to both of your health. I says, I hate to tell you this, but Mrs. Bush says you snore too. And I already have friends my age who sleep apart from their spouses because of the whole snoring issue. And Brack, he looked at me like I was crazy. And I'll never forget what he said. Never. He says, I have to reach out in the middle of the night and take her hand. I have to know that she's there. I have to know that she's there. I'm like, oh my gosh, that's true love. They slept together until the very end.
Wonderful. So I just, yeah, it was very moving. What beautiful couple. One of the things in the very beginning of your book, you have a very long list, pages of names of people and where they are. And at one point you have a line that George Bush said. He said, "It's not who you know, but who knows you." What did he mean by that?
I'm not even sure. It's not who you know, but who knows you. Oh my gosh, you've thrown me for a loop. After a whole hour of talking to you, I actually don't remember that quote. I don't think it was a connection with this. It might have been. He used to be a big name dropper. And one of the things, usually name droppers are very, they're obnoxious. Nobody likes a name dropper. But there's something about it. I think it was Jeb who thought this was very funny, that there's something endearing about a president of the United States who name drops. And as I mentioned earlier, he never figured out that he was the most important person in the room. And that quote could have been in that context, and that he used to say, it used to sort of tease about that. It's not who you know, but it's the people who know who you are. And he would sort of laugh about it. He was funny, his name dropping. We would really tease him about it. And sometimes we wouldn't know the name of the person he was name dropping. He says, what do you mean you've never heard of this person? He was a catcher for the Astros in 1968. I'm like, okay, whatever.
Well, and I'm going to ask you a final question here. And it's referring back to his 9 lives, because I kept thinking, his 9 lives, I think, contributed to he did not fear failure, I think. He didn't. And,
he was fearless. He's the most fearless person I knew.
So do you think his post-presidency, he was most satisfied with that more so than he maybe had been with his presidency? Because there was so much he did.
That's a great question. I don't think so. That's a really interesting question, though. I do think he did enjoy no longer having the restraints of the presidency. And, there's just so much more as a private citizen that he could do in terms of travel and, getting things accomplished. He was very mindful of the fact that not being president could be liberating once in a while. He was very sad when he was not reelected, but he got over it. He once told somebody, there was a guy in Maine who had been fired from a very high profile job in the hospitality industry. And he managed some of the Bush's favorite restaurants. And he asked if he could come over and visit with the president. He said, I'm having a hard time right now. Do you think President Bush would visit with me? I said, of course. So he comes over and they're having a drink together. And he's saying to President Bush, You just have no idea how embarrassing it is to be fired from a high profile job. I can't go out. I don't want people to see me. I'm so embarrassed. And President Bush looked at him and said, Rich, I was fired by the American people. I had the most public firing a person could ever go through. And you know what? That totally changed. That my friend's depression was over. He's like, oh my gosh, you're right. And what President Bush said to him is, shake it off, take a deep breath, and figure out what you're going to do next. And that's how he approached his post-presidency. He spent a few months being sort of sad and definitely very introspective. And then I'm convinced, Brack, he woke up one day and said to himself, I'm back, because we were off and running for the next 25 years after that.
Well, Gene, thank you so much for this evening. I've enjoyed it. I agreed with Tim, who wrote to us, who said a very enjoyable evening with you all, and we'll definitely read the book. And I really encourage everyone to. It was a treat. It was.
Thank you, Brack. Thank you, Tim. By the way, if anyone's going to buy the book, I'd be happy to send them a book plate, a signed book plate. I don't think the autograph of Gene Becker is worth a lot of money, but if you give your name and address to the Alexandria Library, I'd be happy to send them a book plate. This has been a lot of fun. You are such a great interviewer. You asked me questions that no one else has. I've done a lot of these events and no one's asked me about Don Rhodes. I love that you asked about Don Rhodes.
Well, thank you, Gene. And really, and Gene is actually working right now on the 100th anniversary of George H.W. Bush's birth.
His 100th birthday. He will turn 100 on June 12th, 2024. And we're going to do a big celebration at his library. You're all invited. Everybody. Oh, look, I just saw that message from Paula Trivet. She was one of President Bush's White House nurses, one of his favorite nurses. Paula, I'm sure will be at the 100th birthday. She's writing it on her calendar right now, but we're going to have a big celebration. And Brack, you're invited. Everyone come to Texas A&M and we'll celebrate.
Thank you so much.
Gene Gibbons, you're invited too.
Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone. And look for more virtual events we have at the Alexandria Library. And thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. And this recording will be on the library's website within the next couple of weeks. Thank you again.
Thank you, Brad. Good night, everybody. Good night.